Hey everyone, this is Nick. It is hot as all hell here, so forgive my reddish appearance. And this week, in this episode, we've got some big reverts in the code of the x.org project, as a lot of stuff that the xLibre developer left behind him was apparently accepted without really too much validation behind it. We also have maybe what is the biggest data breach ever, with 16 billion entries exposed with logins and passwords. We've got the release of Plasma 6.4, and we've got a bunch of other stuff, including the segue to our sponsor, ProtonVPN. You probably all know about Proton and their end-to-end and zero-access encrypted suite of services. You've got email, contacts, calendars, a password manager, storage space, but also a VPN. And ProtonVPN does a lot of stuff. Since it comes with its NetShield ad blocker, it means that running ProtonVPN on your phone or on your computer will also block all ads, including these annoying mobile ads that you might experience on your phone. Switching between different ProtonVPN servers also lets you overcome the IP-based restrictions, like not being able to watch something based on the country you're in, or how many articles you've read for a certain day or week. This all goes away as soon as you use ProtonVPN and switch between servers regularly. And of course it does everything a VPN does, which is protect your online activity with a no-log policy, a fully open source application and codebase, and it's regularly audited independently as well. I use ProtonVPN almost every day. You can do so too. You have a link in the description of this video. So it looks like the x.org codebase is being cleaned up after the recent removal of the contributor who started the xLibre project. Maintainers looked at a bunch of the code that this person wrote, and they elected to revert a bunch of it. Among the things that were removed were licenses and copyright notices that were not being handled properly, notably removing the previous copyright of certain pieces of code and replacing it with their own copyright. So basically taking ownership of someone else's work. They also tried to relicense some parts of the code to MIT or X11 license instead of MIT and X11, which does make a difference. Some other code that was removed broke render or broke the NVIDIA drivers, so of course that was reverted. Basically, a lot of stuff that just didn't work right or wasn't tested properly was just reverted. And if it looks to you like something went wrong, why is this code merged into the master branch of x.org if it's so crappy? Then you're right, there is something wrong. Well, from what I could see, a bunch of these commits and changes were approved by the same maintainer, who seemed to assume that this code was tested enough and seemed to assume that this code was preparing the way for more features coming to x.org, but in the process it broke a lot of stuff in the master branch, which is being used by a lot of distros to actually ship updates to x.org because the project itself just does not do any regular releases. Of course, since the person making the xLibre fork has made a strong political statement about it right off the bat, this is a politically charged topic, so people will be annoyed at anything that happens around this. I'm sure some people will frame this as Red Hat removes code from developer who tries to create the fork, whatever. There's gonna be someone spinning this in any form of light. It's fine. What it seems to look like is that this person wrote some pretty bad code and also tried to appropriate some other people's work, and a maintainer just did not really look at it and trusted the guy wholeheartedly, which led to some bad code being added. It's now reverted. This code is probably in xLibre instead and will be improved upon. If you like that, that's cool. Now, the biggest data breach ever has happened this week. Researchers found 30 databases that contain about 16 billion entries stolen by malicious actors, complete with Google, Facebook, Apple, GitHub, Telegram, and more accounts and passwords. Now, granted, some of those 16 billion entries probably overlap between the multiple different databases that were leaked, so it's probably a little lower than that, and as people told me on the daily news, this number is probably a little bit inflated for sensationalism, but it's still very likely the biggest data breach that ever happened. These databases were quickly locked down, but it's enough to have simply one person accessing it and sharing it or selling it to be a problem. And obviously, it is a huge threat to everyone who uses the internet. So as always, when something like that happens, check with the have I been pwned, stuff like that, or the various services that check if your passwords are exposed, and just generally change your passwords for vulnerable accounts, enable two-factor authentication, not by SMS or email, use an actually solid form of two-factor authentication, like an authenticator. It's not perfect, but it's better. And also, apparently, all these datasets are mostly new, meaning they've never been exposed before. They could contain information that has been exposed before, but the databases themselves are new, except a big one of 184 million, which is a drop in the bucket with the 16 billion entries that were leaked. So, to be clear, it's not old leaked data that's being repackaged and sold as a new database. Some of it might be old, but a lot of it is current logins and passwords. The structure of these datasets seem to follow the same pattern. There's the URL for the website, the login for the website, and the password. It's basically how info stealer malware functions. That's the data that they grab. This is 100% going to be used for phishing, but also identity theft on a mass scale, and some datasets also contained cookies and authentication tokens, which, while they are valid, can be used to bypass two-factor authentication as well. So basically, it is sort of a nightmare scenario for the internet. It's not everyone's information that's being exposed, because if you have 5.5 billion people using the internet, 16 billion entries would only be 3 accounts per person, assuming no duplicates. So it's probably more 30 accounts per person and a much lower number of people being affected, but it's still a pretty bad story for the entire internet. So as always, do open your password manager, check all the important accounts, change the important passwords, save them back, and then enable two-factor authentication everywhere you can. It is annoying to log in with it, but it is far more secure. Might also be a good opportunity to try out passkeys that I've heard a lot about, but I didn't really try yet. Now this week we also saw the release of Plasma 6.4. You might have watched my dedicated video on this channel or on PeerTube, in which case you can move to the next chapter of this episode or this podcast. But if you just want the TLDR, you will get per virtual desktop tiling, you will get a revamped screenshot tool with a more integrated interface, more like an overlay than an app. You get color codes in KRunner, which you can copy by clicking on them. You get the first steps for the Wayland Session Restore protocol, meaning that Session Restore will actually start working properly now. You get improved accessibility with better keyboard navigation. You get a revamped UI in the KDE frameworks, notably when creating new folders or files. You get the desktop automatically dimming when an application asks for your password. You get better system monitors. You get a night and day wallpapers that switch automatically. You get a new animations page in the settings to change all those little graphical animations when opening, closing, minimizing, maximizing windows. You also have improved notifications with action buttons appearing in the notification history. You get Do Not Disturb by default when doing something full screen. You've got graphs in the file transfer notifications. The widgets also got a few updates with a new tag appearing next to newly installed applications. You also have a playback speed indicator and selector in the media player applet, and more. You even have an HDR calibration wizard, more options all around. It is a fantastic release with a lot of new stuff and a cool focus on accessibility, since there's been a lot of discussion around that in the Linux community recently. So tackling that is good. There are a lot of efforts being done on accessibility. It's not there yet, it's not perfect, but it is making really solid progress, so it bears a mention here. Also, this really cemented my opinion that KDE Plasma is currently the best Linux desktop environment. It is simple, it is way less buggy than it used to be, it has a simple design, a lot of options that are now surfaced when they need to be and hidden when they don't. I know some people will always prefer something else. For me, at the very least, KDE is the best desktop environment right now, and I plan on keeping using it because it's really, really good. Doesn't mean I don't love GNOME, it's still very nice. Now, last week you might have seen that Denmark was ditching Microsoft Office and Linux, but this was falsely reported by the original outlet who did the interview. They said they were gonna ditch Linux, but actually the minister never really said that. Everyone, myself included, picked up on the story, reported they were dropping Linux. They're not, they're just dropping Microsoft Office. But in Germany, though, there's an organization ditching Microsoft stuff more and more. It's Schleswig-Holstein. It's a German federal state which already started their transition away from Microsoft in 2023. They're phasing out Microsoft Office, including Microsoft Teams, and they're going to replace that with LibreOffice and Open Exchange at the very least. Maybe some other stuff will be replaced. 30,000 public employees already moved to open source solutions in this state, and they plan to do the exact same with 30,000 teachers in that state as well, for 60,000 people using open source solutions. Apparently, they're also planning to replace Windows with Linux over the next few years to completely replace their dependency on Windows, although that transition is a longer-term thing and not done right now. The minister in charge of these efforts said that the geopolitical situation for the past few months made the path that they've chosen way more interesting not only for themselves but also for other countries and organizations. So of course it's not an entire country replacing their entire Windows fleet with Linux, it's just one German federal state, but it's still a pretty big step forwards for Linux in general. Now what we need, I think, is an actor or a group of actors proposing a turnkey solution. They would give you installs of Linux with the technical support needed, installs of LibreOffice, Open Exchange, Nextcloud, whatever else, and all the technical support locally that you need for that transition, all the training for the employees or the public sector employees, basically the entire package. This is what Microsoft gives you when you sign for their subscription or whatever. Maybe the support is paid extra, but you do have all of that. We need one single point of purchase, a single entity selling that, and maybe partnering up with local entities, local shops, local groups, to help accompany this transition. But I think the real only way to move forward with this transition from Microsoft to open source, including Linux, is having a solid all-in-one provider instead of having every single EU country or department or ministry or state looking at their own Linux distro, their own Nextcloud instance, their own thing. We probably should have a turnkey solution that can be self-hosted or software as a service and would be way easier to deploy and understand. Something that is not going to help Meta's case or AI in general, Meta's LLM, Llama 3.1, can apparently recall up to 40% of the entire first Harry Potter book, word for word, and it will spit it out on demand, little bits by little bit, something that is probably copyright infringement, because Meta just does not have the rights to those books, and is actually currently being sued for using copyrighted works to train their AI. What's interesting is that since the first version of Llama from 2023, this percentage actually rose, meaning that despite their legal troubles that are currently ongoing, Meta didn't give two craps and doubled down on training on unauthorized material. Of course, this is not limited to Harry Potter, but the model is also very capable when it comes to spitting out The Hobbit, 1984, and a bunch of other very well-known books. Now, this memorization could be attributed to meta training on public forums where people repeat quotes over and over again. But what the model can spit out isn't just a few sentences that are quote-worthy, it's full passages from the books. Most AI companies say that these are fringe cases and that you have to work very hard at a prompt to get the model to spit out verbatim text. But the real gist of the issue isn't really reproducing the content, it's whether just training on that content is copyright infringement or not. The US Copyright Office said it was not covered under fair use, but then their director got fired by the president the next day for publishing their findings. Other lawsuits haven't really gone anywhere yet, and there are basically three theories that would make AI use of copyrighted works infringing. First, you need to make a digital copy of the work to train on it, which is infringing. You don't have the right to make that digital copy without asking the publisher or having a deal with them. Second, you have to copy information from the training data to the model, so the model itself could be a derivative work. And third, the model can generate a portion of a copyrighted work verbatim, so that would be infringement as well. And of course, until a court of law in the US and anywhere else in the world decides to rule on that, which is taking way too long, we won't know if this is a problem or not. Obviously, I do think it is a big problem, others don't. We'll have to wait and see where this goes. What is certain is that these companies know that they should probably pay publishers to have the right to access their content because they already struck a lot of deals with the publishers that had the financial means and power to sue them. They haven't struck deals with publishers that don't have that strength, which seems to indicate that they know they should pay, but they won't pay anyone that just cannot sue them realistically because they just don't have the money or the army of lawyers that's necessary, which is the most corporate thing ever. Hopefully those lawsuits happen at some point or ruled, and finally, we can see if these companies can pilfer the internet at will or if they do have to have some little modicum of ethics, which would be nice. This week also marked the death of the Hackintosh, as Apple announced that the next version of macOS, macOS Tahoe or macOS 26, will be the final one that runs on Intel-based Macs. This means that anything that releases in 2026, which will be called macOS 27, and everything that releases after that will be Apple Silicon exclusive, and likely will not contain any of the necessary bits to run anything on x86 computers. Without these bits, of course, you can't run this OS on an x86 Mac, but also you can't run it on any Hackintosh. It also means app developers will slowly stop building universal binaries that have the code to run on those architectures, so even if you managed to keep an older Hackintosh or an older Intel Mac running, it likely would not run any apps after a few years. It will just stop working with everything and become unusable securely and efficiently. Now, maybe someone will still be able to create compatibility patchers that port drivers and kernels from older versions of macOS to the newer ones, and maybe they'll be able to bypass the compatibility checks. But as soon as the entire default apps completely lose all the bits necessary to run on x86 Macs, then you're done. It's just never gonna work. And having used some of those legacy patchers on an old cheese grater Mac Pro, they're just not worth the work that you have to put in to patch those systems. They're already super unreliable. I wouldn't hold my breath for that happening for an entire architecture conversion using parts of an old macOS system onto a newer one. Now, it does make me sad because I've played around with Hackintoshes since 2008. My very first laptop was turned at the time into a Hackintosh running, I think it was macOS 10 Tiger or Leopard, one of the two. It was fun and it worked fantastically once I managed which kexts I needed to check in the various installers that I tried and used, and once I figured out that it was just going to use USB 1 speeds and so would take 9 hours to install. But it was fun. Virtually every single computer I've owned since then, I tried first thing after unpacking it to install macOS on it, just to see how much it had progressed, how it worked, and if it was fun. And then I removed macOS because it is a really bad operating system for my own use case, but it's still fun. You're learning another architecture, you're fiddling around, it's cool. Now this will no longer be possible, and it kinda sucks. Maybe someone will be able to do kind of the same thing, but for other ARM-based devices, but I highly doubt that that's gonna work. And let's conclude on some gaming news. First, the Steam Deck passed 20,000 games on their verified and playable list, which also means 20,000 games marked as compatible with any device running SteamOS. Recently added titles in the verified category include Stellar Blade, Star Overdrive, Myst Masterpiece Edition, Riven, and Myst 3 Exile. And games added to the playable list include, notably, Dune Awakening. I'm not going to repeat the same stuff every time. More games equals more people potentially playing on a Steam Deck or SteamOS device equals more successful Linux gaming equals good. There's also a cool change in the latest Steam beta. No longer will Linux users have to go to the Steam menu, options, then go to compatibility and click enable Steam Play for all other titles for them to be able to install anything on Steam. It will now be enabled by default for everyone. So opening Steam after a fresh install will just let you click on the buttons to install your games, no matter if they are an officially supported game with Proton or any other game. You don't need to take a trip to the options, you don't need to restart the Steam client, and in the compatibility options, all you get is a selector for the default Proton version, and that is it. And it is a great change. It was something all Linux Steam users probably did anyway if they wanted to game, because you didn't really have a choice. It made no sense to keep it disabled by default, especially since there are more chances today that a game will run than it won't. So the experience isn't deceptive either. Native Linux games will still have their native version by default, it won't be automatically Proton based, and all other games will just have their install button ready to be clicked. Now what would be good is if they added the SteamOS compatibility rating right next to that install button every time they detected that you're running Linux as a whole. The SteamOS compatibility rating is going to be the exact same whether you run SteamOS or Linux, unless you run a very, very weird distro that shouldn't run Steam in the first place because it lacks all the compatibility libraries, the frameworks and whatever that Steam is supposed to install with itself. So technically, displaying the SteamOS compatibility rating should work for every single Linux system, so it would be nice if it was shown next to the install button, so everyone would have a quick view of, hey, this thing will work or this thing probably won't. Would probably be a good step forward. Anyway, it's one less option to check, and it makes sense for every Linux user to just have their games available because they just tend to work. And if you want to start gaming on Linux, but you don't just want a Steam Deck, you want a full-blown gaming PC, check out our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. Chances are you've heard about them by now if you follow this channel or this podcast. They make laptops and desktops that ship with Linux pre-installed. All the hardware that they sell is picked specifically because it is really, really compatible with Linux, which completely removes the headache of trying to run Linux on a normal device that you would buy in any normal shop or from a big name manufacturer. I only use their computers these days. Everything that you see or hear from me is done on one of their laptops. All of the gaming stuff that I do is done on one of their desktops, and they have a gigantic range. You'll find something that suits your needs in there. Click the link in the description to learn more and to find your next Linux running device from Tuxedo Computers. Anyway, this will conclude today's episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it or listening to it. You know where all the usual YouTube buttons are. Quick note, there will not be an episode next week. I'll be on vacation, so the Linux News Show returns in the first week of July, so in 2 weeks. Don't be alarmed, it's normal. Thank you all for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one in 2 weeks. Bye!